to be looking at some fundamental questions that must be answered about gender-based violence. Because we know that this is an issue that we keep addressing. We're not really seeing the success that we want to see. So I'm going to ask you, what are the hidden costs of gender-based violence in the workplace beyond absenteeism, productivity loss, and mental health burdens?
Thanks so much for that, Prof. Am I okay sitting here?
You're totally okay. You
Okay.
must all sit there. We want to see you. Yes.
I actually had quite a long-winded response. And if you don't mind, if you can humor me just for 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I
You've got
can
5
read.
minutes, eh?
Yeah, 5 minutes tops. Okay. So, in response to that question, I think that the intimate workings of violence enacted on vulnerable positionalities require that we looked at affective economies, specifically of shame, hatred, and dehumanization that are tied directly to GBV, especially targeted at Black women. And I'm also going to break the rules here, but I also want to speak about queer people and non-hegemonic masculinities. Okay?
Oh, that's not breaking the rules, that's part of it.
It's part of the agenda. But one of my major concerns here was I'm hearing everyone speak about action, right? And for me, I'm always wondering thank you. So I'm always wondering what our scope is for understanding what action is, okay? And I'm also hearing everyone is talking about the importance of recognizing care work. But my major concern here is sometimes I feel that just our understanding of gender is quite rigid. And we're building policies and we're talking about implementation based on a very narrow reading that oftentimes erases even some women that are part of this informal economy, specifically sex workers. And I'm concerned because I feel that a lot of this violence that we talk about within the workplace would impact women that are within the sex work industry that are not seen because of the morality discourses, even among feminists themselves, okay? Secondly is also there's a question around what are we thinking is women, okay? We cannot ignore the facts and the experience and the existence of trans women. So just our reading on when we say beyond, for me is a bit problematic because there's actually still a within, right? We need to start thinking about what is happening within our readings of what gender-based violence is, right? Which kinds of people are we recognizing as possibly vulnerable to gender-based violence, okay? And what kinds of economic activities are they involved in that are oftentimes entangled with major morality discourses, right? And more broadly, respectability politics. So my response to that question is one of, can we please take it a few steps back, actually? I find that we currently do not have a positive language within which to speak about women that do not fit neatly into these politics of respectability. Absolutely, I think care work is important. And of course, even women that are in care work, right? Just the fact of being a mother, a wife, a caregiver in your family, an older sister, an aunt. We all are kind of given these major responsibilities, and it's easier to read violence that happens within those contexts, okay? But what does it mean for us to then think about trans women that are going through that same violence but are still subject to care work that is not being recognized as care work because of the difficulty of reading them as women in the first place, okay? And then in terms of the sex work industry, we all know, history will remind us, especially in South Africa, the migrant labor system, right, is one where sex work in South Africa really flourished. And today we're seeing multiple images. I love popular culture. So if you are looking at Showmax, we have these shows, This Body Works For Me. It's quite a strong assertion, okay? But what we're not being shown even on these shows is we're seeing all of this agency, but oftentimes we are not privy to the kinds of violence that even happen within the sex work industry, okay? Just because sex work is work, right, and sex work involves the use of your body, it does not mean that, violence or rape is an impossibility for sex workers. So on the agenda, how do we go about decriminalizing sex work putting it on this agenda of economic empowerment, and perhaps not necessarily regulating the space, but I'm not quite sure what needs to happen, because I think there's a great deal of advantage that happens with a kind of unregulated space. But I think unregulated and decriminalized are not the same thing, okay? And they'll allow us to open up a conversation where we can talk about the kinds of violence, physically, but also economically, that women like sex workers and trans women that are still subscribing to their family spaces and their institutions, right? And therefore have to perform in a particular way in cosplay. So I think for now, I'm just going to park my response there because I've got a lot of thoughts, and yeah.
Thank you, thank you. For us who know gender-based violence, we know that the hidden costs that we are talking about in many cases are not just the absenteeism, presenteeism, productivity, it's the emotional cost, the psychological cost, and the way that we refer to disability-adjusted life years, which means people cannot function happily and normally as human beings because of the consequences of gender-based violence, including the discrimination, the homophobia, and the intolerance, the ignorance of society with vast impact. We're going to move to Ms. Christy Kruger next. And we're going to ask you, can G20 Labour and women's empowerment platforms integrate GBV matrix into corporate and national accountability?
Do you want to project? I don't know, I saw that there was some
hectic
talk about use of mics. I want to, thanks so much. So, I guess in a sense that's a very easy question because it's a can. Yes, they can, should they? But I feel like Molly, I would like to take a step back there, and I wanted to sort of very briefly talk about two different things. The one is to break down this notion of gender-based violence, right, and separate it into sort of I mean, there's a concept of gender and the concept of violence, and I think both those things are really important when we talk about including. Expanding the economy to include women, to include queer people, non-binary people within the economy and policies. But I want to sort of pause for a moment and to say that I think a conversation that we have, and we have it every single time we have these panels, and I'm so aware of the fact that everyone says this, and I'm sure you all, like me, so tired of talking about policy and giving the little spiel about South Africa being so great. We have such great policies, but we don't apply them. And of course that's true. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have policies. We absolutely should. I think if we turn to the US for a moment and we look at what's happening there, we see, you know, why, even though it's not always applied very consistently, it's so important to integrate policy because the slide is so quick and so severe if that's not embedded in national legislation. However, I think, as you have said, I think when we think about ways in which policies can be integrated, we need to take a step back and look at what is it that underpins gender-based violence in many cases and that excludes people, because those are the kinds of things that we need to think about, you know, having in policies and implementing. I think we already have, you know, quite good legislation, we have good protection. Clearly, when we look at the rates of gender-based violence, it's not working. So for me, what we need to do is to take a step back and think, okay, why is it not working? There are people who know much better than I do why it's not working. But for me, I want to sort of concur. The funny thing about being towards the end of the day is that, you know, it's been a good day because there's so many things that's already been said and I don't want to repeat all of it. But I think we have to really think about the ways in which we use these categories that have, to a large extent, been imported from the global north, right? So how can we use something like formal and informal economies in a way that's more useful? Like, that is such a, I think, problematic distinction to an extent. It excludes people like sex workers. It tends to further sort of categorize people in those who are deserving of inclusion, i.e. mothers who do a good job because they raise their children, and sex workers and trans women who are bad and therefore shouldn't be included. And so I think speaking for myself as from an academic space, I think we need to start having these conversations before we start even talking about can they include? Yeah, of course they can. But I think there should be a more vigorous and robust conversation about what it is that needs to be included and how we can incorporate some of the voices that are often missing in conversations. And I see sort of moving smooth. And pull that through into policies that will not sort of mirror that which is very generic in some spaces, but really speak to the problems and the issues that are contextually based here to address the specific problems that we have here. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for that. We know we've got this frustration with policies, we do have the legislation, we've got it all, but it's not working. We know it's not working, and there has to be a way to mobilize. That's not happening at the moment. So good conversations to continue. I'm going to move to a good acquaintance of mine I'm very fond of. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure you most do, Advocate Thando Gomeda, activist. We've served on many platforms together in the past. I'm very happy to see you. And I'm going to ask you the most difficult question, because with we looking at these intervention and the mandatory training and the safe transport and the legal address, what is proving effective and scalable that you are aware of?
So, thank you so much for the question, Prof. Folks, what I've come to learn over the years is that if you want to solve a problem, you need to understand the genesis and the root cause of that problem. And that requires doing a historical autopsy on the ways in which that problem was birthed. But even before that, we need to set out the elements that are definitive of the problem itself. And so it's necessary for us to establish our point of departure in our discourse. And of course, what I mean by that is establishing language and the meaning around the words that we are using, being gender-based violence. Because I often find that even in academic spaces like these ones, our point of departure of what we're talking about is not the same. So my interpretation of gender-based violence is that it is unfair discrimination of a human being based on the premise of their sex, gender, and sexual orientation, and it creates arbitrary and harmful biases and privileges. There are 4 key elements surrounding gender-based violence that I want to unpack before I even get to answering the question. The first is with regards to the creation of biases and privileges. In other words, gender-based violence must both elevate and subjugate in order for one side to rise and the other one to be compromised and to go down. So gender-based violence is therefore a non-scientific methodology which enables the empowerment and disempowerment of 2 different demographics or 2 or more demographics, because basically what happens on the left side of the equation does not happen on the right side of the equation. Based on sex, gender, and sexual orientation, what this ultimately means is that every single human being can be a subject of this violence as long as it falls in the basis of those realms. Unfair discrimination and arbitrariness. In other words, there's something called fair discrimination that exists, and sometimes that gets weaponized against us as we are seeking social justice. So fair discrimination is a situation wherein an imbalanced equation is rebalanced not by means of equality, but by means of equity, meaning that you must do whatever it takes on the left side in order to balance the right side of the equation. Unfair discrimination, however, is different in that it does not care for any types of mathematical principles and logical reasoning. It forces predetermined outcomes that are random, non-scientific, and irrational, which then brings me to my last key element, which is actual harm. In order for there to actually be an instance of gender-based violence, there has to be a cumulative result of damage that is done. And this damage may or may not be visible to the naked eye, but it's always real to the person or the people who experience it. And it ultimately impacts the whole of society and not just the individual. But the harm is always real. So we're not just talking about perceived harm, but real harm. And so now that we've established our point of departure for our discussion, I want to then unpack a phenomenon called school-related gender-based violence. And the reason why I think it's important is not just because of the Kwekwe situation, but the Kwekwe situation highlighted something that had been rotting and was a pervasive illness in our society that we purposefully, intentionally did not want to address, which is school-related gender-based violence. So school-related gender-based violence is, amongst other things, or inter alia as lawyers like to say, physical, sexual, and psychological violence within and around educational contexts based on the premise of sex, sexuality, or gender identity. And it includes bullying, corporal punishment, non-consensual physical, sexual, and verbal harassment, and it may even lead to rape and murder. And teachers and students can both be perpetrators and victims. And the sites of violence are not only isolated to main campus, it also includes your dormitories, your residences, as well as your sporting arenas. Globally, hundreds of millions of young people and children experience some form of SRGBV, but only 1% actually go out and report it. And the main survivors of SRGBV are LGBTQIA+ communities, students with disabilities, girl children, and those from impoverished backgrounds. So it's been reported that the impact of SRGBV is missing at least one grade of your basic education that you will never ever be able to regain again. And if you understand how violence works, it means if you're a boy, you're likely to become a perpetrator in your adulthood. And if you're a girl, you're likely to enter into the cycle of victimhood. There are 4 core factors that exist in why SRGBV is not being addressed, not only in South Africa, but across the globe. The first is the lack of access for justice or the justice ecosystem for young people and children. The second is the lack of governance, reporting, and accountability mechanisms. The third is poor knowledge management and poor conditions, or rather coordination of decision makers, leaders, departments, and various stakeholders. And finally, the lack of disaggregated data, monitoring, and evaluation tools. So whilst I'm here to be speaking about how good the interventions are and which ones are working, the reality is that in South Africa we've done little to nothing when it comes to adequately addressing school-related gender-based violence using evidence-based and scientific methodologies and interventions. And the sad part about this, folks, is that there are well-established case studies and reports from across the globe where the economic, or rather the socio-economic DNA of those countries or those communities resemble South Africa, and yet we have never bothered to use those things. According to the Council of Europe's Violence Reduction in Schools initiatives, there are 7 factors which must be present in an SRGBV intervention. 1 is that it must have a structured educational component. Number 2, this educational component must be bespoke and accommodating of learners of diverse learning needs and backgrounds. Number 3, the educational components need to have positive behavior focus. Number 4, the intervention must be long-term. Number 5, the intervention must be school-based and embedded in the curriculum. Number 6, the intervention must include monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. And number 7, the intervention must include social and emotional aspects of learning. So in India, as well as in certain parts of South America, there were quasi-experimentations or closed-off experimentation and case studies that were done amongst your preteens and so between the ages of 12 to 14. And the case study that was done in Mumbai, India, found that when they were done with the program, these boys' socialization and thoughts about young girls not going to school and being married off at a young age actually changed. So those boys, once they were done with the program, felt that no, girls should actually stay in school and that they should be able to, have autonomy over their body. So just in conclusion, I want to go ahead and say in my final remarks is that SRGBV and GBV as a whole are preventable. However, South Africa has only begun to scratch the surface when it comes to the establishment and the implementation of scientifically proven and evidence-based interventions, which can interrupt the residue of colonially implanted patriarchy across the country. And this is largely due to the fact that we have, folks, a leadership crisis, not only in South Africa, but across the African continent. Because even if these interventions were to be introduced, they would not be sustainable under the leadership that we are currently experiencing. An intervention cannot survive on its own. It requires effective guardianship, orientation, direction, and protection. Without it, it falls apart and it disappears into the abyss of what could have been. And this institution, the University of Johannesburg, whilst it is not a government institution or a body, has the power to pilot projects, implement research, and drive science within its own four walls, creating an environment in which anti-GBV and decolonial interventions are placed at the center of educational outcomes, social experiences, and cultural practices, ensuring that no one graduates from this institution, be it staff or student, as a violent patriarch, but rather leaves this place as an active role player in the radical transformation and democratic project.
Thank you, Dr. Benita. Those are powerful words and key insights to show what can be done if it is to be done. We're going to move to Dr. Ntando Maposa from UJ, part of our fraternity, and I'm going to ask you the question. How can fiscal and social protection policies be designed to account for the economic vulnerabilities and income insecurity experienced by survivors of GBV?
Thank you. May I borrow your mic, please? All right. Thank you. So when you speak about development of policies in the first place, the first point of contact is the people that you're making policies for. So do we have any policies where women who are actually abused and the survivors are actually consulted and partnered with in development of those policies? Actually, very on few occasions where that actually happens. So that should be the first point of contact in designing such policies. Having women as people that you actually consult with and having them as collaborators, because they've been through the experiences, they understand their challenges better, and they know exactly what is needed to be able to address their challenges. That's the first one. And when we speak about fiscal policies, we are a rich country, basically. We are. I mean, there is about 21 billion that was actually set aside for efforts to fight gender-based violence, according to the national. Yes, there's money. So if there's money, money that has been pledged by private entities as well and the government, but we find that women are not accessing that money. I'll speak about social services now, moving to social protection. We have shelters that are available but don't have funding. Women can stay there for 3 days. Some don't even allow them to bring their children. So the issue of care work as well, child support. How then do you leave your house, leave your abusive partner, and leave your child behind, knowing what kind of man he is? So that actually makes women end up not leaving those abusive spaces. So needing the channeling of those resources, which is money and other issues, things that are needed, is very crucial in making sure that these policies are actually implemented and these social protection measures are fully effective. Because at the end of the day, without any resources, it's just not going to work. What is also quite important is to realize that we also don't have any workplace policies that perhaps would look at abused women. There's very few spaces that actually give you leave particularly for gender-based violence, and for you to go and take care of yourself at home, you have to take annual leave. If you don't have annual leave, if you don't have sick leave, then what do? So if there can be policies in the workplace that can actually focus on the issue of gender-based violence, because you cannot hide away from it. It's not a private issue that we have to hide behind closed doors. We must provide spaces for women to be able to speak about their abuse in the workspaces and provide safe mechanisms that are available for them to actually make use of. Because I can imagine you being an abused woman, you need to take leave and you go and you're hospitalized because of your physical injuries that you need to deal with. On top of that, you get to work and you're told that you don't have a job and you don't have a plan B. So that just makes life very difficult, and that is why the issue is still continuing as it is, because we don't really have proper mechanisms and social systems in place. The other issue that we can also look at is the access to social welfare services. The assumption is everybody is eligible for grants, for example, but it's not everybody. There are women who are actually South African citizens who don't even have documentation. The children don't have birth certificates, they don't have ID documents, so they cannot even access whatever measures that are there in place, such as your grants that are actually cash transfers that can actually help you to move away from the income insecurity. And so at the end of the day, their economic vulnerabilities are dependent by the GBV and the lack of policies that are actually inclusive. Because we have to look at the fact that if you don't have documents, then what plan is actually available for you? And then the other issue that we are grappling with as a country that we need to address in terms of social protection measures is the issue of skills development. So even if you are in a shelter, most shelters don't have resources. I spoke to some of the abused women in a shelter, and then they said, we're supposed to be going to do our driver's licenses, but there's no money. I only managed to do 5 lessons, and then I was not able to do any other, because there's actually no money that is available for us. So the plan was good in terms of empowering women with a skill that they can actually use to go and find a job and participate in the economy where they're actually excluded. But because of the lack of resources, that wasn't implemented fully, and they're not able to actually get out of that particular situation. So if we can look at the issue again of making sure that when we're looking at skills development, then we actually have enough money, like the budgeting needs to be gender sensitive. There's a lot of budgets that are actually not being used by different institutions. So let's reprioritize those budgets and actually focus them on addressing gender-based violence, because there is an emergency at the end of the day. It's not something that you can wait and say, we're going to do it tomorrow, we're going to do it after 5 years, because women are dying each and every day. We get stats of women actually being killed by, whether it's partners or whether it's through other forms of death, but there is definitely an issue that needs urgent addressing. And then on the issue of fiscal policies as well, there are some countries, actually African countries, that actually have budgets for abused women. That women can actually go and borrow money for businesses. But we don't have as South Africa. If it's there, then it's actually quite limited. So having microfinance opportunities where women can actually go and borrow money to be able to start their own businesses. Some of them actually have businesses. Think about women selling tomatoes on the street, but they don't have the capital support to actually grow their businesses. So having those kind of structures in place can actually be helpful to enable women to participate in the economy and get themselves out of their abusive situations can actually be an effective way of dealing and preventing GBV penetration at the end of the day. And then the other issue, and the access to we're in a world where there's advancements technological wise. So AI is now there. There's jobs that you can actually do virtually. You're staying from home looking after your children, but unfortunately, what about the resources? Because for you to have a job that you can do virtually, you need a laptop, you need a mobile phone, but then you don't have gadgets, you don't even have Wi-Fi and things like that. So and even child care support that is subsidized by the government can actually make a huge difference. It's actually one of the causes that we have to look at. So we need to look at such issues. And also the informal economy, like we also have people making money from content creation as well. So women can actually make use of that and actually be involved in the economy through that